I'm reading today from the Gospel of John, the 13th chapter, beginning with the first verse. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part in me." Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, "Not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you as an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." My mom grew up in the Assemblies of God. And when she grew up, at least, the week between Palm Sunday and Easter, they had church almost every evening. And on Thursday of the week between Good Friday and Easter, they would always have a foot washing. Now, for my mom, that meant she was getting new shoes, because that's when her mom bought new shoes for all of the kids, was before the foot washing at church. So they would have new shoes on when they showed up. And she would show up for the foot washing with brightly polished shoes and clean socks. And God forbid if her feet were dirty when she showed up for the feet washing. It would have just mortified her mom. Now, foot washing isn't something we do that much. And that's because we live in a different time, in a different place, with different customs. Foot washing is a custom that's been left behind for most of us, with understandable reasons. Back in Jesus' time, where Jesus lived, most of the roads weren't paved. They were dust. When it rained, they were mud. And when it was hot, they were dusty. And most people wore some type of sandals, if they wore shoes at all. And just like today, the women in charge of the house didn't like people coming in and tracking dirt and mud all over the house. Some things change, some things don't. So it was custom when you arrived at someone's house that one of the servants would meet you as you came in. You would sit down and take off your shoes, and they would wash the dust or the mud off of your feet. Now, there was a TV show that was on a few years ago called Dirty Jobs. This would have qualified. Washing people's feet when they come in after having been barefoot or in sandals all day on dirt roads. Either it's muddy or it's dusty. The things we have that might be similar would be taking off your shoes in the mudroom in the house, or your boots and leaving them there. Some cultures still, everybody takes off their shoes before or as immediately after they enter the house. And they walk around the house in stocking feet or in slippers that are provided for them. The similar job to foot washing is another job that's kind of disappeared. But my dad's father, my grandfather on my dad's side, it was his first job. He was a shoe shine boy. And he'd set up by an office building, and when people came up, they would sit down in a chair and he would shine their shoes. And they'd pay him a little bit. And he was so proud that he still had his shoe shine kit from his first job. Again, not considered that important a job. Or it's one of those jobs that's important, but nobody wants to do it. You want somebody else to do it. We don't know that there were any servants at the house where Jesus met with the disciples to have the Last Supper. Which means one of the disciples should have taken up the job of washing people's feet. But it was a job nobody wanted to do. So they're all probably sitting around waiting for somebody else to do it. You ever been at work and there's something that needs done and you're all hoping somebody else will do it first so you don't have to? I spent a summer working at a church camp, and we're all eating lunch. And in the middle of lunch, we hear this loud crash and breaking glass. And I'm ashamed to admit, all the guys on staff just sat there and looked at each other, wanting somebody else to be the one to get up and clean up the mess. We heard about it that night at the end of the day meeting, that none of us were quick enough to take on the task. So Jesus notices that nobody's done this important task for hospitality. Even more so when you understand that they didn't eat the Last Supper sitting around a table like we eat. There was a table, but it would have been low to the ground, almost like a coffee table. And then spread around the table would have been couches. Not that you would sit on, but that you would lay on your side. Which means, if you're laid on your side and you've taken your shoes off to be comfortable, everybody can see your feet. And in this situation, everybody can see that nobody's feet have been washed. So, probably not going to make for a very comfortable dinner when you've got to stare at everybody's dirty feet while they're eating. So Jesus gets up to take care of it. Shocking. Jesus was rabbi. He was teacher. He was master. That's not his job. One of the disciples is supposed to do it. Of course, none of them are. Jesus does it. Now, we don't know how many people feet Jesus had washed before he gets to Peter. But Peter, being Peter, isn't going to let this go unchallenged. Jesus should not be washing Peter's feet. Thaddeus should be washing Peter's feet, or Matthew should be washing Peter's feet, but not Jesus. Certainly Peter didn't think he should be the one going around washing other people's feet. But he just knew it shouldn't be Jesus. It's not proper. Jesus, you're not going to do it. I'm not going to let you. And then when Jesus insists, Peter says, well, then give me more. Wash my hands and my head as well. And Peter's probably shaking his head, at least internally. Jesus is probably shaking his head at Peter. Oh, how long do I have to put up with you who don't understand what I'm trying to say and do? Now, they mention twice in this passage about Judas, about one who would betray Jesus. It's important to remember that Judas got his feet washed. Jesus already knew Judas was the one who was going to betray him. Just a few verses later, he tells Judas to go out and do what he's going to do. He knew it was Judas. Yet he knelt at Judas' feet and washed them, cleansed them. And we're told by John in the scripture that Jesus washing his disciples' feet was to show how much he loved them. And Jesus washed Judas' feet. That means Jesus loved even Judas. We don't think about that. The last thing Jesus did for Judas was an act of love. You know, I've been preaching for over 30 years and I've studied the Bible a lot. And I've come to the conclusion that according to Jesus, there are two types of people in the world. Our neighbors, who we are supposed to love, and our enemies, who we are supposed to love. Jesus didn't just make himself servant to the disciples who were faithful. He washed Peter's feet, knowing that Peter would that night deny him. He washed Judas' feet, knowing that that night Judas would betray him. He washed Thomas's feet, knowing that Thomas would doubt his resurrection. We want to be like the disciples. And I'm not talking about being like the disciples as followers of Jesus. Oh, we want that too, but we want somebody else to do the dirty jobs. We want to be the one that is served, not the one who serves. That's human nature. Why do we go out to eat? Because it's nice to have somebody cook for us and bring the food to our tables. Not have to do it ourselves. And sometimes we'd just rather pay somebody to do it than do it ourselves. And that feeling of being served makes us feel good. We want to think of ourselves as deserving to be served. We want to think of ourselves as important people. I love reading stories about people who try to pull the "do you know who I am?" You know, whether they're pulled over by the police or they're demanding special treatment at a restaurant. Do you know who I am? No, should I? You know. Because there's a part of us that is like that. And Jesus commands that we reject it. And he commands in the most powerful way possible by demonstrating. You think you're important. You want to be a leader. Then be servant to everyone. And there is something to be said about the power of servant leadership. George Patton had a favorite story about leadership. He said, people are like spaghetti noodles. He said, you can't push spaghetti across your plate. You got to pull it. You got to be at the front. Put the fork at the front. You can pull it across in a straight line. You try to push spaghetti, it gets all knotted up. You got to lead from the front. You got to be a servant. I found this to be true in ministry. I've had to lead churches sometimes, places they weren't ready to go. Had to get them to confront things about themselves they didn't want to see. And I've had colleagues ask, well, how did you do it? And I said, I earned that right. I earned the right to tell them they were wrong by years of loving them, by years of visitations, by years of deathbed visits and hospital visits. By hours spent in prayer for them and with them. By showing up and doing the work of ministry, I earned the right to lead them. You want to be a leader in the church? That's where you start. Be be servants. It's not about the ritual of washing the feet. It's about the act of doing things for others that may be unpleasant, that maybe no one else wants to do, but that need to be done. Our closing hymn is number 581, "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus."